Professor Esterling, you are a professor of political science and public policy at the University of California, Riverside. The coronavirus has already prevented many traditions associated with the presidential election and is expected to transform traditions associated with inaugural celebrations. Do you believe this pandemic has created just a bump in the road? And as soon as there's a vaccine and we return to society, we will continue our ways in the following election cycle? Or has COVID opened up an opportunity to rethink how campaigning, voting, and inaugurations should look like in the future?
Well, I do think that just like in many aspects of our lives, the pandemic and the need for social distancing has kind of upended things and made us kind of look for solutions that enable us to interact safely. And I think especially the Democrats in this last cycle really embraced using technology to do things like campaigning. So I think the Biden campaign mostly did its work online and didn't really do a lot of kind of in-person kind of door-to-door campaigning until late in the election cycle. And the Democrats hosted a mostly video national convention for their convention, which is usually this kind of big in-person celebration, but they did it as a video convention mostly. And I think that people really liked that a lot. So that seemed like a good experience to them. And then in some of the work I've done, I've seen members of Congress really embracing the use of video conferencing to communicate with constituents. So even just a year ago, I would say for most members of Congress, they really didn't use video conferencing. It was really almost like a foreign concept to them. But once the pandemic hit, many of them kind of rapidly switched to learn how to use video tools to communicate with constituents. So I think that in a lot of ways, there's been a lot of learning and that will probably carry forward after the pandemic ends. But I think it's a little bit early to say kind of what the new normal will look like. And part of the reason I say that is I think it's true that there's been a lot of learning and that technology creates a lot of opportunities to do kind of interactions between the public and elected officials. But people are social, people are, right? So Aristotle told us that we're social and political animals, and we kind of get some energy by kind of meeting in person and interacting, having kind of interpersonal interactions in person. And if it's okay, I'm going to try a metaphor here, a sports metaphor. So normally I watch every season, I follow college football really closely. But this season, I find that I'm really not as interested in it as I normally am. And the reason is, I think, a big part of that is that there aren't crowds, right? And that's kind of ridiculous because it's the same game. It's the same players on the field, and it's the same level of play on the field, but there's just something that's missing without the crowd there. I know that might sound ridiculous, but I think it's true that we just get kind of some energy out of sort of events where people interact with each other in person. And I think that's something that people crave. One thing I do think will persist, though, is that we've learned a lot about voting, kind of alternatives to in-person voting. And I think that will persist. And so I think a lot of states that switched over to voting by mail and having longer early voting periods and those kinds of things, I think that's probably with us to stay.
Definitely. I am a baseball fan, as well as NFL as well. And a few weeks into when they did resume the season or begin the season, they put those like life-size pictures of fans and, went to their donation and to their foundation. And at first I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And then they added the fan noises, but I completely agree with you. And I think it's the same with campaigning. When Joe Biden, gave his acceptance speech in Delaware, I loved that the cars were honking, and even though you couldn't see the thousands and thousands of people like previous years, I loved, the car honking. It's like, oh, I'm sure when someone's giving a huge speech like that, you want something in return. You don't want to, it's not like you're just talking to nobody. That you are getting some type of a reaction. So I definitely agree with you on that part.
And then the other thing that might be interesting to see is if there's a difference between the parties, because the Republican Party really continued its campaigning in person, right? And having Trump had rallies and there were lots of in-person events. And so it'll be interesting to see if there's a difference between the parties going forward.
No, definitely. I think it's given us also a great opportunity to think of these new initiatives, right? And still maintaining that communication, still, forming those relationships and bond despite, not being in person. So it's definitely a little bit on, a learning experience, but also a great way for us to learn, technology and, I guess the greatness behind it as well. I wanted to switch, gears a little bit. And I know, we talked a lot about, and I know in the news as well, it was heavily talked about, the voter engagement that we saw in this election and, the turnout, in numbers that we haven't seen before in previous years. But I also understand that there is a little bit of lack of transparency and communication, despite these, voter turnouts between representatives and constituents. We kind of just wanted to ask you, where do you think lies the problem in this lack of transparency and communication? Is it that, there's not enough constituents civically engaged? Is it that representatives are not acting on their responsibility to reach out to their constituents? Where lies that, lack of transparency?
Yeah, so this is really something that's of great interest to me because a lot of my research looks into this and maybe looking for solutions for that. So I think the problem for transparency isn't because elected officials themselves are uninterested in hearing from their constituents. And so I've worked with lots of members of Congress. We've all talked to elected officials at different levels of government. I've yet to meet one that's not actually very interested in knowing kind of what's on their minds of their constituents. And then likewise, constituents, most people want to feel like they have a voice in government and that they're heard, right? So it's not sort of a lack of will on either side. But the way I think about it is we have kind of a problem of scale in our democracy, which is that our country is of such a size that it's hard for individuals to find they have a voice in government. So if you think about most congressional districts for the House of Representatives are on the order of about 750,000 people for one member of Congress. And so there aren't ways right now, kind of built-in ways or institutions that enable individual constituents to really have a direct interaction with their member of Congress. And I think it's true even with every level of government, but especially true once you get to that level. It's not because elected officials aren't interested in hearing from their constituents, but there's just nowhere for them to go to talk to their constituents. And likewise, there's no place for constituents to go to have their voice heard. If either of you have ever worked in an elected official's office, or if you talk to any friend of yours who's worked in a member of Congress's office, you know that there's no shortage in a congressional office. There's no shortage of communication coming in from constituents. So constituents do have opportunities to kind of express themselves. But if you've talked to anybody who's worked on a staff of a House member, what you find is in every single office, so this isn't a Democrat thing or a Republican thing, it's with every single office, it's always either the lowest paid staff person or even the interns who aren't paid are the ones who are tasked with responding to constituent mail when it comes in. And so typically what they do is as messages come in, the intern just cranks out kind of templates of responses. And part of that is just because of just the flood of messaging that comes into a member's office. But part of that too is because most of the messaging that comes into a member's office is not particularly informative for the member. So here in Riverside, our representative, Mark Takano, already knows that a lot of people in the district don't like Betsy DeVos, our Secretary of Education, right? So he doesn't need to read every letter when people write to him saying that they're mad about her. it doesn't help him in any way. And so in a sense, because the information that's coming in is mostly kind of top of the head messaging like that, it doesn't make sense for each member of Congress to kind of sort through that. And so they tend to think of responsiveness to that as how quickly can they get templates back out in response. But at the same time, because of that, the constituents themselves don't really have incentives to do much better, right? That if you know that you're just going to get a template response, then why write a thoughtful, researched message? And so you could think of it as kind of like a catch-22 that nobody wants, right? So members of Congress would like to learn what's on the minds of their constituents and kind of extract new insight from constituent communication. But even if they waded through all of the communication coming into their office, they're really not going to learn very much, right? And then at the same time, constituents aren't really putting a lot of effort into writing thoughtful things because they're not being listened to. And it's just kind of the circumstance that, like a catch-22, that nobody wants, but it's the situation that we find ourselves in, just because there aren't kind of these opportunities to have direct engagement.
Yeah. How just sort of a follow-up, you know, a lot of it is through mails and letters, but how do you think this sort of, you know, transparency, communication, engagement has been affected by, you know, this social, this virtual, you know, learning thing that we're in right now? How do you think that COVID-19 has sort of impacted the way that we still communicate with our representatives?
So, you know, we talked about just a minute ago, that a lot of representatives have really switched over to making use of kind of off-the-shelf technology to have communication with their constituents. And so a lot of members have switched over to using Zoom webinars to host interactions with constituents, or using Facebook Live and kind of tools like that. And that's new. But the problem is that those tools are not really well kind of tailored to the problem of, you know, enabling constituents to have an effective voice. And you can think about that if you've ever been like on a Facebook Live event, that what members do is they kind of, they're the ones that are on the video stream, and they get to sort of say their messaging. But the constituents don't really get to say anything in response. And essentially what they get to do is type in messages in the chat, and so you see the chat just kind of scroll by. And then quite frankly, when I sit on, you know, a lot of those myself, I'll see that a lot of times constituents seem kind of frustrated with it, and they end up, you know, sort of what ends up in the chat can be kind of vitriolic and even hostile, right? Because they feel like they're really not having an opportunity to have a voice. So I think that that they've learned a lot about using technology to communicate, but because the technology that's available kind of off the shelf isn't well designed for kind of fostering constructive interaction, that I think people can still be frustrated with it.
Yes, and you are the director of the UCR Laboratory for Technology, Communication, and Democracy, which is so cool and very impressive. And I know you've been doing a lot of work, as you've mentioned, with Congress, members of Congress. So you just talked about, you know, maybe Zoom webinar, or, you know, I see the same thing on Facebook Lives. You see, or YouTube, you just see, you could scroll and scroll and scroll, and a lot of the time it may not even have much to do with what the representatives are talking about. If someone out there is developing, or if you are, or anyone you know, if you're developing a new software, a new technology that can seem more personal and more interactive, do you think that would be popular? How would you go about that? And would it help bridge that gap that we've been talking about?
So this is a project that some colleagues and I have been working on for about 10 years now, of trying to think of how to design technology to enable this more constructive engagement. And we actually started the project about a decade ago with a grant from the National Science Foundation that was actually joint with the US Congress. So our partner on that project was the Committee on House Administration. And so the House leadership was part of our team to sort of help us kind of think through what would be kind of workable best practices to for using technology to communicate with constituents. And what motivated us is this idea of kind of how an interaction is designed really shapes how people engage each other. And you can think of that as an analogy to in-person meetings, that if you are ever in a meeting where people are seated in rows and there's a speaker in the front, you know the dynamic is going to be there'll be questions and answers to the speaker that's in the front of the room. But if you took the exact same people and arranged them in tables that were circles, that completely changes the dynamic, where people would start to talk to each other rather than to the speaker. And so you can think about just analogies in your own life, that kind of the situation that you're in really shapes how you interact with other people. And we think about that way with technology too. So there's really not a lot of investment and not a lot of commercial kind of development, that specifically thinking about how to have kind of a constructive engagement between constituents and their representatives. And so what we have are kind of the off-the-shelf commercial products, like a Zoom webinar or a Facebook Live and those kinds of things. But those products really aren't designed to enable constructive engagement. It's just wasn't the use that they had in mind. And so what we did for our project is we thought, well, let's instead of kind of limiting ourselves to that, let's think about, is there a way to redesign the technology that would maybe enable a more constructive engagement between constituents and a member of Congress, so constituents didn't feel like they were being kind of just messaged to, but they were being listened to. So we did our project. We kind of modified this. So it was about 10 years ago. We did a project where we modified off-the-shelf technology, but kind of embedded it in a set of best practices that enabled kind of more interaction. But we also kind of we have a sort of a set of recommendations to members of Congress that when they host a town hall, they want to work really hard to get kind of a cross section of ordinary constituents in, not the kind of, not necessarily the activists who show up at all the in-person meetings, but just ordinary people and the full cross section of their district. So you don't just have kind of an echo chamber of people who agree with each other. And then we recommend that the event be on a specific topic, so that both the member and the constituents get off of just their talking points, but they can go into depth on that topic. And we also recommend sending out nonpartisan, neutral reading material ahead of time, so everybody feels empowered to participate. And then have a kind of a neutral host to the event. So it's not kind of the member of Congress or their staff, but there's somebody who's kind of a neutral moderator. And then the last component is kind of the design of the technology, right? And sort of what the interface is and whether the member, sort of the presence of the member in the event, so that the constituents know that they're authentically actually talking to their member of Congress and not to a staff person posing as the member and that kind of thing. So yeah, and so then I've been, through my lab, I was fortunate to get a grant from the Democracy Fund to build our own platform. So we're not kind of limited to Zoom or Facebook, but we're building our own platform. It's called Protanium. And what we're doing is we're using, we're building in more tools that enable constituents to have meaningful engagement throughout the event. So that for example, if a member hosts a town hall through Protanium, constituents can ask questions, but then they can comment on each other's questions, and they can upvote which questions they want to have next, and they can flag questions if they felt that there needs to be some follow-up. And so the interface that we're designing is much more kind of robust and interactive, so that people will feel like they'll have an opportunity to really have their voice present in the meeting, even if it's not their specific question that's being asked.
Help
And
steer
then,
the conversation where,
yeah,
where
yeah.
the majority thinks, yeah.
And then on top of that, after the way our platform is going to work is at the end of the event, everything that happened in the event is going to get exported to a website that would then continue the conversation offline. So all of that kind of commenting and engagement would be, and all of those tools will be available on the website that the constituents and the member can keep the conversation going even after the event ends. And so that's pretty exciting, I think. So everybody will feel like they'll have an opportunity to really have a voice and to be engaged in a way that's pretty constructive.
Yeah, that sounds like a really cool initiative, actually. And, I'm hoping that maybe as students can actually use that as well for our own classes and,
for sure,
get those questions up there for our professors.
Yeah. Well, we want to use it for, so there's different use cases. And so I think higher education is another important one for us.
Yeah, and I think that's going to definitely help as well in futures. Also, I wanted to, ask a little bit more about sort of the Democratic Party, kind of what we saw in this past election. In both 2016 and 2020, an overwhelming number of candidates from the Democratic Party ran for president and landed all over the spectrum from moderate to progressive. What does it mean to you when the two frontrunners of the Democratic Party, seen with Clinton and Sanders or Biden and Sanders, promote such different policies?
So, well, first of all, I need to say I'm not a pundit, so I might not be the most qualified person to answer this, but I am a political scientist, and the way I think about it is there's actually very little disagreement policy-wise within parties nowadays, and that's true for both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So since about 1980 and the Reagan Revolution, there's been kind of a realignment in this country and a big sorting of partisans to where it used to be up through the 60s and 70s, you had Democrats who were actually agreed with a lot of the policies of the Republican parties and Republicans who agreed with policies of the Democratic Party. So you had a lot of debate within parties about policies. But with the realignment starting in the 1980s, and that's continued ever since then, that the parties have really sorted to where there's almost complete agreement within them. It's certainly at certain fundamental levels in a way that there wasn't before. So in political science, we call that polarization, and that there's really very little kind of disagreement within parties. Now there is, so if you think about it, for the Democrats, whether it's the members of Congress or the candidates running for president, they cared about the same things. They all want to reduce inequality and poverty. They all want to improve access to healthcare. They all care about climate change, and they all want to dismantle systemic racism and systemic biases, right? And even things that used to be very controversial, like gun control and abortion, there's really not a lot of disagreement within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party. But I think within the Democratic Party, it might be the biggest difference is sort of how quickly and sort of the pace at which those topics get addressed, right? So the Green New Deal or Medicare for all, right, or defunding the police are all sort of, policies or slogans that are kind of messaging about kind of the pace of change rather than the topic of change. But I really don't think there's a lot of disagreement policy-wise in the Democratic Party. It's got more to do with kind of the pace.
So it's sort of that prioritization, right? What we're going to focus on in the now, and then what we can get to later, right?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. Through a lot of my public policy classes and speaking with so many professors, yes, we can agree, but then it's almost what stage or what phase are we going to agree upon? I know Joe Biden ran on, I'm going to add on to Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. Others kind of wanted to do away with that and start new, maybe go farther. So I like that. We do agree, on fundamentals, morals, ethics, but maybe the specificities of, well, what are we going to do about it? And I hope in the coming years we can rally around that. We really do agree on the basics, and so, a very famous, in politics, but how are we going to get there? And then that's where the compromise and listening to each other really comes in. And for President-elect Joe Biden, he has a handful on his plate. He has a lot he wants to do in the first 100 days. And as he enters the White House, he does face a power struggle. And I know we've seen this with, so far, his nominations for cabinet members, where he's known for working across the aisle with Republicans. Some view him as very moderate, some view him as too progressive, a communist. It's hard kind of labeling him within the Democratic Party, and he's been in DC for so long. Many want, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or AOC to have a position somewhere. What can he do in office to bring this message of unity to the Democratic Party, that we're all on the same team and we all want to work together?
So I have a friend who's working on the Biden transition, and she works in national security issues, and she's not senior. So, but I did have a chance to talk to her, and I did tell her, if I had 5 minutes with Biden, what would I tell him? And so let me try to say what I said, which is that it really has a lot to do with what we just talked about a minute ago about how much there really is, in principle, a lot of agreement within the Democratic Party. But then this kind of pace of change is kind of, I think, is what's frustrating Democrats. And you saw it kind of explode, in the news a couple of weeks ago, shortly after the election. The House Democrats had a conference call where Abigail Spanberger, who actually is my mom's member of Congress, she's a moderate from Virginia, was just furious with the progressive wing, I think mostly personified by AOC and her colleagues. And there was, I don't know if you saw that, but there was this kind of news story about that sort of very heated exchange. And if I could tell Biden one thing, it would be to help both the moderates and the progressives in the Democratic Party to understand sort of that, how to think about that pace of change, and how it does not need to necessarily be conflict between them. And the message I would want to give, and this would be infuriating, I think, to both wings of the Democratic Party, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that I think that both wings don't really know how much, like, their own thinking about policy and what's possible through policy was set in place by the Reagan administration 40 years ago. And I don't think that they realize that how much conflict they have between them is because they've accepted the terms of debate that Reagan set out for some of them when they were really young, right? And so it's what they've grown up with. And the reason I say this, and I don't think it's controversial as a political scientist to say that Reagan came to power wanting to advance a small government agenda, but that agenda in and of itself is not that popular among Americans. And so what the Reagan administration, the Reagan campaign did, and with Lee Atwater and other staff people who worked for him, was to come up with a strategy that kind of linked the idea that what government does is government helps people of color, and furthermore, when government helps people of color, that hurts white people. And that's a kind of distillation of the kind of strategy that Reagan used to pull together a coalition that was in favor of small government. So you guys are too young. This is all ancient history to you, but they had talked about, like, welfare queens, right, are the ones who get welfare and that kind of thing. And it, you know, in a way, you know, as a political kind of strategy, it was very effective, because what it did was it kind of galvanized the sense among mostly among white people, and now we're especially seeing it among rural white people, this idea that it must be, when the government does anything, it's going to help people of color, so that's going to hurt me as a white person. I don't think that. I was pointing at myself because I was pretending to be someone who thinks that. And I think that if you look at that call between AOC, you know, sort of the dispute between AOC and Abigail Spanberger, you see it playing out, because AOC, I don't remember if she said this or if she tweeted it, but she, you know, her main messaging was, well, what moderate Democrats want to do is they want to not be as progressive in helping people of color, right? And to sort of have, like, let's attend. And so the way AOC sees it is that, you know, what moderates want to do is to put the rural whites kind of in line ahead of minorities, to sort of make sure that they're helped as well, right? And but policy wise, it doesn't make any sense, because any policy that helps to reduce inequality helps people of color, but it helps rural white people as well, right? And that there's really no reason for us to see, for any of us to think that there's really a trade-off between the policies that either wing of the party wants to do. There's no trade-off. It helps both sides, but I don't think that they really understand that. They're kind of locked in this kind of Reagan sort of ideology of thinking about what's possible from government action. So you could think about Abigail Spanberger's congressional district. It covers just the west end of Richmond, which is kind of a wealthy, you know, suburban district, which is the kind of district that really has gone Democrat recently. And then you go a little bit west of there, and there's some malls, and then you go west of that, and it becomes a very rural, right? And so so Spanberger has, her district kind of contains both of those. You know, she's kind of straddling that. Mm-hmm. And what if I could tell Joe Biden one thing, it would be to have him kind of get Democrats to say, to realize that they don't need to sort of think in the terms that the Reagan administration defined 40 years ago, that they could break out of that and think about how to think about policies that make AOC's constituents happy, but those same policies could also make both sides of Abigail Spanberger's constituents happy, that there's really no necessary reason that they're kind of at odds with each other, or that there's any reason why sort of being moderate or appealing to Spanberger's constituents would mean that it's watering down progress, right? Or telling communities of color that they need to be patient, right, while we attend to these moderate districts. That those aren't necessarily, we just don't need, I mean, Democrats don't need to think that way, so.
Yes, going back to what we were talking about earlier, and what you are working on, I think constituents sometimes feel as though their representatives are not listening to them. And I think representatives are not listening to each other, and they have different districts and a diverse group of people that they need to meet their needs, and as well as, you know, their own moral, ethical, what they believe to be true. And I hope these last 4 years, for so many reasons, have been very chaotic. As a young person and part of Gen Z, I don't think of it in this way of, oh, we were born into this system. We don't even realize it was different 20, 30 years before I was born, and that we don't have to stay this way. We can evolve into a new system. And I think just a basic would be if everyone listened to each other and understood that we can help each other. We don't have to hurt each other in the, along the way. And I think people have just stopped listening, which I think is really unfortunate, and it's hurting us in the long run.
Yeah, I think people think of politics as being combative, but I think that, but what I think people crave is for the government to find solutions now. And then the bigger challenge, so the challenge that I was talking about a minute ago was to find some way for Democrats to talk to each other, right? An even bigger challenge is finding ways to have Democrats and Republicans talk to each other and kind of bridge those divides. Mm-hmm. And that's getting harder and harder. It's something that is a persistent problem, and it seems to be getting worse. And, we all know that people of different ideologies sort into different echo chambers, both in their communities and in their social media worlds, right, where they just hear messaging that confirms their views. Mm-hmm. And we're kind of locked into that world right now. And it would be great if we could think of some way, right, to solve that, to get people who really have different views to be able to talk to each other, to speak across their differences in some way, and maybe even to learn some way from each other.
Yeah, and I hope the future of technology and what you are working on can help us do that, help us reach more people, and then do our part of listening and following through with that. So Professor Esterling, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was so informative. And I think as Biden's inauguration comes up, all eyes will be on him for one reason or another. So, I really hope to see a more unified country where we can just get a lot done from the constituents all the way up to the president. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you for having me.